I'm Elaine Ikeda with California Campus Compact, and these webinars that we're doing are a partnership between Campus Compact of the Mountain West, California Campus Compact, and Utah Campus Compact. Before we jump into the content of today's webinar, I'm going to just go over a few logistics on our Zoom platform for those of you who might be new to Zoom. If you put your cursor down towards the bottom of your screen, you will see hopefully see some things pop up. One is a Q&A, a box that says Q&A. If you have any questions for the panelists during the webinar, you can type your question in here because you will all be muted during the presentation portion of this webinar. So we encourage you to ask any questions. Some may be answered along the way, but if not, we will have time at the end for your questions to be addressed at that point in time. But throughout the webinar, you can use that Q&A box to type in any questions that you have. And if you know they're directed towards one particular speaker, you can indicate that as well. That would help us out. Something else, and I know we'll have people coming on continually probably as the webinar goes on, but as I said, you're going to be muted throughout the whole thing just because there are quite a few folks registered for this. Another feature on the bottom of your screen should be the chat box, and if you have any technical challenges, feel free to chat a message to either, well, you'll see my name up there and you can send it to myself or to Piper McGinley in our office, who's also monitoring the chat box. You can move the photos of the presenters around. If you don't like where they're located, you can just drag those little photo boxes somewhere else on your screen. And our presenters will be advancing. What you're seeing is the start of their PowerPoint. You'll be able to see that they will be changing the slides, so you don't need to worry about anything about that. Also, I want to let you know that probably within a couple of hours after this webinar, it will be available on our YouTube channel. And so if you wanted to watch it again, you could do a repeat. Also, within the week after this webinar, we'll be sending out the link to the slides. So the resources that are shared in here, anyway, the resources that are shared as part of this slideshow you'll get that. Just so don't worry, and we'll repeat this at the end because I know there are still people signing and logging in. And so someone just chatted in that the Q&A box, the chat box might appear in a different location for you. It may be at the top of your screen. For me, it's at the bottom of my screen. If you can't see it right now, just move your cursor around and you should find where that list of options are. Let's see. Also, probably following this webinar, within 24 hours, you'll also probably get some type of evaluation form, and we'd appreciate you filling that out so we can get your feedback and any ideas you have for future topics. So, on to the content portion. We're scheduled for an hour and a half, so we'll have at least an hour of content and then 15 to 20 minutes for you to do Q&A. And so we know that many of you are engaged in study abroad programs or thinking about designing international experiences for your students, and we want to make sure that we're inviting students to experiences that are thoughtfully created and intentionally planned with community partners. So we invited some people that we believe are doing some outstanding work in this area to share their practices and thoughts with you. So our session today, Emergent, Immersion, a community engagement model featuring the University of San Diego and their partners in this work. I'm going to let each of our presenters and facilitators introduce themselves in a little bit more detail and tell you about their roles. in a bit, but briefly, our facilitators and leaders on this are Chris Naive and John Loggins from the Mulvaney Center for Community Awareness and Social Action at the University of San Diego. Another presenter is Dr. Kira Espiritu, the Director of the Office of International Studies Abroad at the University of San Diego. We also have Stacy Williams, who's the Director of Education with Pacific Discovery. And we have Rafiq Mohammed, who's the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at California State University, San Bernardino. So I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to, I believe, get us started with the webinar.
Thank you very much, Elaine. This is my very first webinar, so apologies in advance. I'm used to gauging audience response, and I can't do that here, so this is going to be a unique and fun experience for me. I'm extra grateful for you all taking the time out of your busy days to join us, as we wanted to present you something that we think is very important to the work of community engagement and how we immerse ourselves in community. You'll see right off the bat, we stunning you all with a Facebook-worthy picture of one of our students in Jamaica with wonderful students. And I think oftentimes when our students come back, they have a hard time expressing what their experience was. And I think they sum it up best by acknowledging kind of the important things to them, but kind of oftentimes the superficial stuff. And it comes across as these pictures. But the real work, I think, comes when you see the same student kind of in the thick of it. Like, you know, there's all this chaos and action and activity around, but how do we maximize that space? How do we get them to be thinking about their own personal work, how it's connected to the community, power dynamics that exist around them, and hopefully that's what we are going to be exploring this afternoon with you all. Just as a reminder for why you all are here, this was ripped straight from the website of what we have promised to present to you. I'm just going to read it very quickly just so you are all on the same page. Access has long been a topic of discussion in international education as professionals determine how to attract more diverse student populations into international opportunities. While this is important, it is increasingly critical to develop inclusive practices in advising, serving, and supporting students from diverse and underrepresented backgrounds as their participation in international activities increases. As we diversify student populations, we need program offerings and reflective experiences that invite students to live with greater social consciousness from host engagement, relationships with one another, and lives back at home. International opportunities can widen our gaze, seeing new realities while illuminating our identities and place in the world. This session explores how to integrate this type of identity development into programs and what often happens when you do. And as you can see from that description, I think we could hone in on specific points from access to social consciousness to personal development. What we're going to try to do is share how taking up this work of being very mindful of our students' development and our personal growth invites diverse populations and diverse groups into the programs, and vice versa. As we invited and started to receive more diverse populations, how it informed and shaped how we take on identity development and social consciousness raising. How we define immersion with this group is immersion is an approach to community-based learning that is intentional in its framing, rooted in relationship, committed to self-interrogation and inquiry, and mindful of power dynamics, historic and presence. The core questions we're going to be examining and sharing with you today are: how is this a practice? How do we take it up as a practice? And how is it inclusive? We've broken down those kind of key elements of our definition into different buckets. And you can see the lists of who's going to be going over what. We all have some shared experiences with this, so we hope for our closing thoughts in the Q&A, we'll all be able to participate in various spaces in the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Kira, who will be talking about intention. And I'm going to be managing the slideshow, so when they say next and things like that, that's just my cue to move forward.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Hello from San Diego. As Elaine mentioned, my name is Kira Espiritu, and I'm the Director of the Office of International Studies Abroad here on campus at the University of San Diego. And I thought I would first start off by offering you a little bit of context, just because of my role here in terms of the way that study abroad programs are done or traditionally done here on campus. So my office is part of the International Center here, and we serve as the hub for any sort of international activities across campus. So we have over 80 different opportunities for students. They're all over the world, and they range from short-term programs to semester-long programs. But if you were to take a look at sort of our standard profile, you'd see a pretty stereotypical view of study abroad. You know, it's the middle to upper class students, and they're studying abroad in Europe for the most part. This may be the same for many of your campuses, but it may not be. But I just wanted to give you some background in terms of knowing where we're coming from in terms of doing this work. So we are an Ashoka Changemaker campus, and so we're really actively trying to change the models of how we do study abroad programming. And slowly over time, the changes are happening because we're working to shift our programming to be able to offer more opportunities for true engagement in the sense that we're going to talk about it today. And I've had the pleasure of working with John Loggins and Rafiq Mohammed, both for a while now, on the Jamaica program, and they will talk to you about that in a little while. And that program in and of itself is truly a model, I think, of our community engagement and emergent immersion and what we mean by that. Additionally, as an example that I can draw from, our office also works with a faculty member in the political science department who started a program in South Africa, largely modeled, I would say, after the Jamaica Summer Abroad program. And so we're really trying to shift the standard paradigm of study abroad to be more engaging and more intentional, but we understand that obviously this model may not work for all locations, and we understand that the work is, of course, going to take time and patience, because as you'll hear in a little while, it's really about starting with the relationships and building from those. So with all of that being said, I've been asked to speak a little bit about the idea of intention in terms of the work we do. So if we look up the word intention in the dictionary, we can find the various meanings that are there on your screen. So an aim that guides action, meaning or significance, or an act or instance of determining mentally upon some action or result. And I think that if we think about what that word means, I have broken it down by various components, if you want to call them that, in terms of what is sort of needed when you're thinking about setting up these programs or continuing them on your campuses. So if we first start with intention and location, in setting up types of programs like this, you need to think ahead of time about the location. So you want to ask yourselves, where are we going? So which locations do we currently have on our list, maybe on your campus, that may be able to lend themselves to this type of program or experience? Do we not have any? Do we need to start looking into those options? So we were lucky here in that Jamaica, when I started in my role, Jamaica was sort of existent and handed to me, and we've worked over the years to enhance the program. But so ask yourself that question in terms of where, in terms of capacity, would you be able to do this work? And then ask yourself, why are we going there? So the why is, what about that particular location is making it a viable opportunity for the engagement and the deep, true immersion of your students and faculty in that particular location. You'll also want to ask, how did you get there? So, or how can you, if you don't already have it? So programs like this are usually developed after somebody has formed a relationship with a person or a group of people or a community abroad. So think about yourselves, who is your network? How are you connected? Where are you connected? And those can help kind of be guiding forces. Because if we look at our Jamaica program, John was connected really through his time in the Peace Corps there, and kind of got the ball rolling. And then if you look at our South Africa program, the professor who leads that had lived there, had done a lot of research there for quite some time, and had formed relationships long before he thought of developing that particular location as a study abroad opportunity for our students. If you look at the intention in terms of recruitment and marketing, we really need to be intentional about how we market the programs to the students to ensure that you're really reaching a wide variety of students, because oftentimes if we start developing these programs, you may find yourselves preaching to the choir, for lack of a better word, to the students who are already maybe predisposed to participate in a program like this, where we're asking them to step out of comfort zones, asking them to really truly engage with people on a human level, and really want to just maybe sit with people, and be okay with that. So we understand, though, that these types of programs are probably they're not for everybody, but we also understand the value in them, and that maybe while they're not for everybody, and maybe a student might join in not knowing exactly what they're getting into, so that particular student or group of students may need a little bit more help in terms of navigating the journey that they'll find themselves on. But we believe at USD that, you know what, it's okay to be uncomfortable, because it's in the discomfort where the growth and the real change we think can occur. So ask yourselves, who are you reaching? How are you reaching them? We find in our office really that flyers don't really do the trick anymore. We're needing to either go to, out into the residence halls at 9 o'clock at night with pizza, and talk to students and meet them where they are and not wait for them to come into the office. Do a lot on social media, do a lot of word of mouth. So it just sort of depends on the dynamics of your campus and what might work for you there. In terms of intention and design, thinking about the design of your program is really critical, because I think without putting some forethought into this particular element, programs can fail. And in that, it's not enough to say, oh, I have this relationship with this person, it'll just work out, we'll just be able to figure that out. Because when you're doing the hard work of really truly engaging and not being a typical or tourist or outside observer, without some structures in place, that can get really overwhelming. And so really being mindful and intentional about program design is really useful. So you want to think about things like program length. How long is your program? Does the site support the needs of the group? Are there facilities? Are there opportunities for engagement? What do those opportunities look like? You may not know until you get there, but you at least have to start with something. So the idea, even in your head, that an opportunity could exist is useful and necessary. In terms of community engagement, how will your students engage with the community? Are there structured opportunities that already exist? Or will these need to be created? Who are you connected to? So thinking about your different range of network within a community. Are you connected to people that might have inroads to schools? Are you connected to people who might have inroads to hospitals or government organizations? Because really it's these local community members and your local connections that will be the key to designing a program like this. Along with design, I also think it's really important to think about the leadership. And when I say leadership, I mean it in a sense of, yes, okay, a faculty member or a staff member leading the program, but also not just in terms of logistics. I mean, I think that being able to do this kind of work, but also helping navigate the process for students, this isn't going to be something that everybody is going to be a fit for. It's important to have people on site who are, from the university, who can not just handle the logistics, details as housing, when the buses are coming, where you're going to go visit, but the many different moving parts of the programs. But also it's really important to think about the need for that person or whoever's going to be in that role to be willing to engage at a deeper, and it's more often a more personal level with students than what traditionally may occur in a faculty-led short-term program. That may be, if it's a traditional program, it may be, they teach for a couple hours, and then maybe there's an on-site staff member who deals with everything else afterwards. But when you're there and you're in community with your students, things are going to come up. So being able to engage authentically with the community is hard, but it can bring up feelings, not just for yourself, but for the rest of the people around you. And so it's important to have a leader or somebody in a leadership position who can negotiate all of that and hold the space that's needed for the students to have a quality experience as well. In terms of intention and process, we here like to use the word co-creation. I've learned that from my colleagues, John and Chris and Rafiq. And so in developing these programs, USD really takes the approach that these programs are going to be developed in partnership. So I've said that a lot, but it's really truly about the partnership and with our community members. So we are actively working to avoid going to locations thinking that something needs to be fixed. And we try to allow for space for natural conversations and relationships to happen organically, because you're not going to have the same students every time, so things might change, dynamics might change. But for them to, out of those relationships, out of those conversations, that's where opportunities for engagement can occur, and they may look different every single time you go. I think something really important that we struggled with in earlier years here at USD, but we worked through it, and I think we have a pretty good model working, is how to keep and continue and sustain these programs. So when you have a program that starts with maybe a passion from a particular faculty member or a group of people, that's great, because there's a lot of momentum behind that. But what happens if that particular faculty member and those cannot go? For example, one year, those relationships were built with that faculty member. And so if that faculty member is not there, a lot of times, if you don't bring in like a centralized office like our office, things just may get lost at the wayside and the program just might not run. And so we had that experience early on with our program in South Africa. So what we learned from that is that as you go along, it's important to bring other faculty members who may not necessarily be wanting to lead right away, but just exposing them and other members of the community on your campus to the program that exists, so that in the event that something has to change or faculty members have to shift out, there may be other people in those places that can take up the work. Because one of the things, obviously, is you want to continue the momentum on your campus to the students, but one of the detrimental things that happens when you're in engagement and relationships with the community is that if you don't show up anymore, your relationship with that community has been damaged, and you've worked so hard to try to build that it's really important that those relationships are fostered, valued, cared for, attended to, even when you're not on site. It's continuous check-in with people back to wherever that local site is. But also, they come to rely on you coming year to year and maintaining those relationships in person. So it's really important that those key community relationships be continued and be valued, and have a structure set up so that if a particular faculty member is tied to the program and can't go, that the program and all of those relationships can remain intact. So with that, my colleague Chris will now talk more specifically about relationships and community building.
Cool. Thanks, Kira. It's great to be with on this webinar with you all, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with us, and it's great to be with colleagues on this panel. And yeah, I just wanted to share some thoughts on this idea of partnership and relationships that challenge in equity. And many of us who are using the framework of Carnegie and anchor institution language that focus on democratic and reciprocal partnerships. And I think while kind of the reason why I drew this graph was, while many campuses are striving for democratic and reciprocal community ties, the concept of equity is sometimes an afterthought. While many of our elders of our work considered equity as kind of central to building relationships that are democratic and reciprocal. So that's kind of why my graph looked that way. And I couldn't figure out a cool way to put color on the left side, so that's what you're dealt with right there. And I think, I wanted to share some several formative moments for me and how I have come to view and experience community partnerships. And the first was learning from our founding director, Judy Ronner, who always stressed this idea of co-created community identified needs. And even though, that concept is more mainstream now, back then there were only a handful of practitioners in our work that formed partnerships that were truly equitable. So I just wanted to give it a space to kind of recognize that. And of course, this list is long. I just wanted to name a few. And, folks like Nadine Cruz, who talked about, community members and community wisdom holders. And she even had, community members grading her student papers. And these were workshops in, the early 2000s, right? And of course, Richard Cohn from USC. and all the work that he's doing in terms of, or what he did and continues to do in terms of challenging how we build equitable partnerships and making sure that what we learn is continued and not, you know, a lot of the lessons learned are implemented in our current work. So those were, you know, some of the early formative folks and moments. And I do want to recognize this important publication that California Campus Compact put together, Community Voices, California Campus Compact Study on Partnerships. So, you know, and then over the years, as we continue to build relationships in the community, many other individuals taught me what reciprocity looked like in action. You know, again, photos on this slide, and so many others. So, you know, I just wanted to make sure I took a pause to recognize that. We can go to the next slide, John.
I think that one was your.
Oh, is that my last slide?
Yeah.
Photo of the house? Okay, cool. Well, then the homework is then that you all will have to go to that publication and look at the photo of the house. Elaine knows that diagram of the house. So another key moment was when John and I we were asked to do this faculty workshop on international community engagement, and this was this aha moment. And it was, you know, how do you do this work in an international context? And so John and I kind of looked at each other and we said, well, you would do this work as if you were doing it in your own backyard, right? These same principles apply. No parachuting in. You know, these same principles of partnership development, whether you were doing it across the ocean or, you know, in your neighborhood. These were the things that were kind of really important to us. So again, I think a lot of that is highlighted in that collective voice publication that was put together by Campus Compact. But then I know many of you who are on this webinar consider this as a practice and how you're doing this work. But those were some of the important formation moments for me as I think about the importance of relationships and building equitable community ties. You know, I also want to share another important moment that I think many of you are experiencing, certainly Campus Compact, most definitely California Campus Compact and USC in general, are these ideas of all these designations, like being an Ashoka Changemaker campus, a Carnegie Engaged campus, an anchor institution, and then of course being a member of California Campus Compact that is, like many of you, probably rewriting our civic action plan. And two of the statements in the action plan, you know, we're putting a lot of intention behind. There are 5, I believe. 2 in particular that I think are relevant to our discussion today. It's this idea of how do we empower our students, faculty, and staff and community partners to co-create mutually respectful partnerships in pursuit of a just, equitable, and sustainable future for communities beyond the campus, nearby, and around the world. And then the other statement was, how do we embrace our responsibilities as place-based institutions contributing to the health and strength of our communities, economically, socially, environmentally, educationally, and politically. So as I was thinking about all of these proclamations that show up in our work as we develop partnerships, you know, if we're not careful, I think, you know, Dick Cohn talks a lot about, you know, these will just basically become like bumper stickers if we're not in true mutuality. So I've been reflecting a lot about this. And in particular, one of our latest articles by a community member, his name is Rigo Reyes, who is part of Chicano Park Steering Committee here in San Diego. He's the founder of the Amigos Lowrider Car Club, community wisdom holder. He has this article called Reflections as a Barrio Alchemist. And a few of the things he was struggling with as he does this work in his own community, I think are worth noting. He talks about the work working with and not for or to the community. This idea of arrogance that sometimes comes from this work. He has struggled with this idea that sometimes he feels he's an entertainer for privileged students. And then he wonders if he has created a dependency on the community he is committed to serve. And then John and I were at a community forum last night, and one of our community partners, he reflected, he says, you know, every September, I know the Goodwill dump truck in the form of faculty and students will be arriving to make a delivery of good intentions. And, you know, this happens often, especially as students and faculty get activated in terms of what they become aware about. So the full force of all the excitement and energy and purpose of doing this work really reaches them. And so they want to burden, themselves and really kind of take this on. And sometimes we have to recognize that community members have been working on these issues before us. They'll be working on it after us. And how do we factor in humility and curiosity in this work? So, at minimum, we do this work rooted in relationships. Inequity still shows up quite a bit. And, I've been thinking about this idea. How do we consider intent versus impact in this work? And I think how this conversation often goes is when it doesn't land exactly how we intended, it sounds like, I meant this. And then the other person says, yeah, but this is how I took it. Kind of reminds me of a lot of the Facebook dialogue I have with some folks I don't always agree with. But, I think it illuminates how well-intentioned ideas and actions can land differently from its intent. And, I thought a lot about this, especially in my role in title and how that shows up in partnership work. That recognizing that my role in title shows up just as much as who I think I am as a unique person shows up. And I can't assume that in building partnerships that we are blind to titles and roles. So, it kind of makes me think of that idea when people say they're colorblind, but I guess that often comes at the expense of being culture blind. So I'll share, I guess I'll end by sharing what my good friend Jordan Flaherty, he's an author, journalist, and activist in New Orleans, what he wrote recently in his new book. It's called No More Heroes, Grassroots Challenges to the Savior Mentality. Totally unrelated to what we're talking about at all. Just kidding. That's a joke. And it's this idea of decentering privilege in our partnership development work. And he argues that the best way to combat the savior mentality is to act collectively for systemic change in a way that is accountable to the communities affected. So, and with that, I'll pass it on to, I believe, Stacy.
Yep, it's me.
Oh, John.
I'm back. Thank you all. I really appreciate kind of the context and the framing of the work that goes into being deliberate about how our intentions of starting a program and how mindful we are about the relationships that we're creating in the community. And I think if you think about immersion as a practice, you can kind of easily see how our roles as faculty and administrators and educators, we needed to be deliberate about those steps and incorporate into our practice. But I also think as many of your centers probably are like ours, rely a lot on student leadership and are dependent on really co-creating with the partnerships. Making sure that everybody's kind of onboarded in those first initial steps is important too. So I think it's really kind of good work to see ourselves in this practice and how we take it up, but to be mindful that everybody who's involved in developing and creating these programs need to kind of have that shared sense of ownership of this as a practice. And what I want to do right now is kind of maybe even direct some of the attention on to how the students take up this practice when they're in the immersion experience. And a big part of that comes in after we've kind of laid the groundwork for them, explain to them they're coming to the community, not to fix it, not as saviors, not to kind of perpetuate some colonial idea that we have all the answers, but to actually put themselves into the community to join and to learn. And what comes up for them is very important, and how they kind of self-interrogate and are curious about what comes up is kind of the focus of this piece of the practice. Taking up the practice. Why do we even want to do this, and how do you convince students that this is an appropriate way to engage communities? I know, for example, Jamaica, as much as I love it, there is a lot of thinking from faculty, from parents who will often say like, well, why are we going to Jamaica in the first place? So what can you learn from Jamaica? And that's where we want to focus on really saying that we're relationship based. We have this wonderful opportunity to kind of learn a lot of different things. I mean, there's all kinds of cultural context, colonial historical knowledge that can be shared. But I think the part that I'm going to examine is really how they bring themselves to the work and see community and see the beauty of it, and not just think about it in a deficit-based lens. Like, we're just going to go in and paint this school, or this particular facility needs all these different things that that we may be able to offer, and I'm going to come in and fix it. And how do we do that is by giving them space to get in where they fit in. You know, we definitely have some partnerships that we explore with students, but a lot of our partnerships steer us and lead us into friendships and very familial ties, and our students have this really unique opportunity to access community in a unique way. So if you are somebody who really likes music, and we can find somebody that's really interested in sharing how they take up music, or if you really like going to a club, you know, I'm okay with it, but don't just do it with USD students. Take advantage of going to those places with Jamaicans. And what we've been doing for the past 11 years now in Jamaica is kind of laying the foundation for our students to kind of have a, you know, a free range of experiences and opportunity to kind of do this work. And why it's important to do it here. I know there's we do a lot of this work. Chris named that, you know, we see the work that we do in Linda Vista here in San Diego very much as we see the immersions that we do in Jamaica. But what's unique about international immersions, I think it provides a lot of room to grow. And you'll see I put that room to grow in quotation marks, and a room being partly about the space that we're occupying, like the room being Jamaica, and Jamaica being a place that I can kind of take off some of my blinders. I believe, get caught up in a lot in our stories. We tell ourselves that, you know, we live in the greatest country in the world, and we don't have problems with sexism or race or class. And for us to kind of challenge those notions means that we have to challenge some really deeply held beliefs and stories that we have about our own country and about ourselves. When you take a student out of that context and put them in a new environment, like Jamaica, or like South Africa, or like Thailand, you give them the space to kind of think about these things from an outsider's perspective, and be able to really look and say, like, oh, they can name a lot of issues that they'd be unwilling to or unable to name at home. And our role as helping them take up this practice is to help them make some of those connections. I mean, ultimately, that's kind of the purpose of why we're out there, I think. We definitely want to give learning opportunities for our students, but I always like to anchor myself to purpose. And one of the purposes of why I've stayed in education for the last 15 years is because I believe that universities are here to be a public good. And what that public good looks like, again, is rooted in anchoring yourselves and providing resources and connections for the community. You know, I think I tend to steer away from the notion of being transactional. You know, if we ever do a project, the relationships are always the focal point. We're going into the community partner, going into the school thinking, how do we build relationships? How do I get our students to fall in love with your students? How do we get that connection to made? And service is the tool. Any product that we do, any kind of deliverable that we have is the gravy. I think oftentimes in traditional service learning, it has been the case that, you know, the transaction is the goal and the relationships is the gravy. And I think we like to try to flip that. And, you know, this is kind of rooted in some of our colleagues' work. Tania Mitchell, I'm sure some of you know, and, you know, differentiates traditional service learning from critical service learning by naming that, you know, all participants seek to redistribute power in the relationships. The cultivation of authentic relationships is crucial, and participants work from a social change perspective. That's a lot different than a traditional service model, to where you are actively, you know, thinking about your course objectives and providing a service for the community. This gives us the space for them to really critically think about themselves and how they take up this work. And why that's important, again, thinking about that get in where you fit in, is that this is the space that students, I think, get to really bring themselves to it. So I can't tell you what's going to come up for a student when we take them to Jamaica. You know, initially when we started, when we were predominantly majority culture, white, affluent, and upper middle class students, you know, you can kind of predict that there'd be some thoughts about being the other, about power and privilege, but that's not true for everybody. And then when we started to to have more students of color and more students that express themselves and identify in ways that are, not the majority mainstream sense of identity. I don't like to use the word normal. They came up with different things. So what they're bringing in is completely different, and their aspirations are a lot different. So this model that I'm showing here is a leadership model that I like to have our students consider and personally consider as I take up the work. Like, when we're holding space, how do we bring ourselves into it? If you see on the left side of the U, that's very much how we bring ourselves to it, how we're open up, how we're willing to connect. And then at the bottom is really where I think all the magic happens. This is where, when they're in the space, they're learning to connect, they're seeing that they can join, and they have a lot of access to a lot of their emotions. And if supported properly, we can offer a lot of support and direction and an acknowledgement of what they're going through as we help them kind of move through the other side of that U and taking up that work, not just in Jamaica or South Africa, but how they can bring that work back at home, how they can actually continually see this as a practice that they can be engaged in around joining and about being present and presencing yourselves in a specific community. This is from Otto Schwarmer's book, Theory U. I think it's a wonderful dynamic. It's leadership-based, but again, I think as we think about trying to redistribute power and social change, that's an important consideration to make. I already know I'm kind of running low on time, so we will, of course, distribute this out. But here's a quote that talks about the Sacred Heart and kind of leaning into that discomfort that Kira was mentioning earlier. I think, it's hard work to do when we ask our students to be present in the community and put themselves out there, because what emerges oftentimes is a very powerful and loving relationships, and loving relationships aren't always the easiest relationships to navigate. And the last slide that I was going to show you was to talk about Sugar and Sean, just very briefly. I can go through the list of a number of stories of our students, but when you think about our willingness to be, to hold what emerges, you have a dynamic where we had a wonderful young student named Trisha on Sean, who's there on the left in the pink shirt, connect with a wonderful young woman named Sugar, was her yard name, at a place of safety. Really connected on a human level, kind of fell in love with one another in the sense that Sean wanted to adopt Trisha, and having the conversations with her in that space to ask, is this something that you really can do? Why are you compelled to do this? Like unpacking all the motivations for it, and then stepping into the work and saying, like, is this something that is doable? She went through that whole process of trying to adopt Sean. It was looking good. And then family members intervened and kind of stopped that process, leaving Sugar in kind of the detention facility, which is what the place of safety is, where she unfortunately passed away last year due to some health-related issues and trying to abscond from the place of safety, which is terribly heartbreaking and real. When we open up the opportunity and the possibility for our students to engage in real ways, they're gonna engage in real ways, and that doesn't always mean easy ways. I think this work can be very messy, and one of the things that I always want to advise and make sure everybody knows when they are taking up this practice is that I think every ounce of it is worth it, but are we willing to kind of hold steady and do our work along with them? Because I'm pretty certain I can take any student to Jamaica and let them have a very surface level experience and get great reviews. It's Jamaica. If I'm willing to push them and challenge them, I'll still get those great reviews, but I'm putting more work and opening up a space for us to learn and grow in different and important ways that I think we need to acknowledge and really start to lean into, because I think as we're trying to become more civically engaged and as we're trying to work towards equity and reciprocal partnerships, this is how it looks. This is the impact that you have to be willing to kind of go through in order to do this work. And I apologize for taking up more than my time. I'll pass it on over to my dear friend and colleague, Rafiq Muhammad.
I think John just wanted me to say less. So, well, I thank you all for joining us today. And my name is Rafiq Muhammad. I'm the Dean of Social Behavioral Sciences at Cal State San Bernardino. But I used to work at USD with John and Kira and Chris. And that's where the Jamaica program that John and Kira and Chris have mentioned originated. And I'll say this right now and get to it in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but we began the Jamaica program really as an alternative to existing programs with the intention of having a study abroad experience that necessarily involved a greater degree of community engagement that gave students opportunities to really connect with people from the community and most importantly, learn from people from the community, not just about where they were, but about who the students were. I think studies abroad provide students a wonderful opportunity to critically examine themselves. Speaking of critical self-examination, the first thing that I want to touch upon is this idea of self-interrogation that John introduced. And I wanted to turn the lens a little bit onto faculty. As an introduction to this idea, I want to use this quote from Cornel West, which I think is illuminating. It's actually two different quotes of his that I fused together. But West asks, what happens when you interrogate yourself? What happens when you begin calling into question your tacit assumptions and unarticulated presuppositions and begin then to become a different kind of person? It takes courage to interrogate yourself. It takes courage to look in the mirror and see past your reflection to who you really are when you take off the mask, when you're not performing the same old routines and social roles. And I think this quote's an interesting way to introduce this idea of self-interrogation when it comes to faculty. Because we as faculty, I think, are great at guiding students through this process of self-exploration, but we are very rarely asked to consider ourselves and to ask how effective we are at turning that lens, that self-interrogation lens, on ourselves. And this is a particularly important question when we're looking at how we engage students and how we make their learning experiences more relevant to them. Next slide, please, John. A lot of the conversation today in higher education, at least for the past decade, has revolved around this idea of high-impact learning practices. And certainly relevant to this conversation, some of the key aspects of high-impact learning practices revolve around community-based learning, diversity studies, and global learning and international immersive experiences through studies abroad. The general idea behind HIPS, or high-impact learning practices, is that students shouldn't just be treated as the recipients of knowledge, rather they should be kind of sent out to find knowledge, and then the role of faculty becomes that of a shepherd, taking students out there to help them find knowledge and to help them process that knowledge that they find. One of the problems I see with HIPS, and again related to this idea of self-interrogation as it relates to faculty, is that there's this presumption that faculty are somehow organically prepared to direct students in this transformation. That we somehow through our training automatically have these tools to take students abroad, for example, and share this experience with them. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. One of the impediments I see here, next slide please, John, is what I call the professorial gaze. And there's a paper that I think we're going to make available to you that I've written in draft form that goes into more detail on the professorial gaze, so I won't belabor it here. But just simply put, the professorial gaze refers to the manner in which we look at things as professors, and this idea that our academic training constructs us as the experts and invites us to view the other in kind of a passive form. And because we are constructed as experts, we can become intimidated by not knowing and by not being the authority. And this plays out, I think, very interestingly in studies abroad and immersive environments, because our gaze is challenged when we are asked to, for example, accept community members as wisdom holders or as co-educators, or when issues of diversity and inclusion that maybe don't manifest themselves necessarily in the United States present themselves in international settings, or when ideas of social consciousness that don't match our frameworks are introduced. A very quick example of this would be looking at, for example, in Jamaica, looking at gender roles. In the evening time, there's a very kind of remarkable and stark division where men are out and about and women are nowhere to be seen. And for some faculty that we've had with us in Jamaica, they've been really challenged by this. They see it as their impulse is to see it as sexism or to see it as gender stratification, when if you dig deeper, the meanings are more complex. And so I'll be happy to talk more about that later or something like that. In any case, I think that if we prepare and encourage faculty to interrogate themselves and suspend their professorial gaze, HIPS, like immersive studies abroad, can certainly be more effective. Next slide, please, John. This is just a quote from one of our students who was reflecting upon the impact that this kind of release of gays had. The student wrote, "I was told that by the time I left Jamaica, I would learn more about Jamaica from my house moms and the locals than I would in classes. I found this to be true. The people that I engaged with shared with me information and experiences that could not be taught in a book." And I think that that's a kind of very powerful manifestation of what happens when we are willing to let go and let others be co-educators for our students. Next slide, please, John. The next thing that I wanted to talk very briefly about, as my time is running short, is this idea of mindfulness of contextual dynamics in developing immersion experiences. Just as a quick backdrop, I taught abroad in a large study abroad program in Mexico 14 years ago or something like that. And from that, it was a great experience for me and for students, but there were two things that I saw as problematic with how some studies abroad can be constructed. The first thing is that studies abroad often can function largely just as extensions of their host institution, where students exist in their university or an otherwise American bubble and don't necessarily get out and experience and learn from the community. And the second thing I've seen with some other studies abroad is that they can be kind of rapidly moving sightseeing opportunities that aren't substantively connected to the place where the students are. So next slide, please, John. As we developed our Jamaica program, we were trying to be very intentional in steering away from this in our program. And we wanted students to understand from the outset that if you don't live in this place and if you're not from this place, you're a tourist. And I often say to students, I've been to Jamaica 30 times. I love Jamaica. Pardon me, that was a stopwatch. I love Jamaica. I love being in Jamaica. I feel at home in Jamaica, but ultimately I know that I'm still a tourist and I have a blue passport that allows me to go home whenever I want. But because I'm a tourist, I don't necessarily have to hold that gaze. I can try to suspend that gaze to invite more learning to come in. And what we found as part of our Jamaica program is if we build a contextual curriculum that prepares students for what they will see, what they'll hear, and experience, particularly when engaging with community members, it can be a powerful learning experience. There in the middle, which I will bypass, is another quote from one of our students who's reflecting upon how that opportunity empowered her in Jamaica. Next slide, please, John. This is just a summary of some of the things that we found useful in developing the Jamaica program. Understanding that it's not one size fits all, we did find that these particular bullet points here were helpful in disabusing students of the idea that theirs is the only history that matters, and also understanding that immersive studies abroad can serve as an ideal way to kind of connect the dots of history and ask students to widen their gaze and take a more critical look at themselves. I know that we are up against the clock, so I will allow you to look at that on your own time. But again, just to underscore the idea that intentionality and being deliberate is important when you're constructing the program, making sure that students have a sense of where they are and why they're there and why listening to these people matters is critical. Just the last thing that I wanted to point out, deliberate design can pay dividends. This is a quote, again, from one of our students, because I think they say it better than I ever could. The connections that were made with the Jamaican people during my time there is something that cannot be bought or replaced. I can always learn how to make rice and peas. I can always go to another crystal clear beach, but people are what made my experiences in Jamaica worthwhile. This trip helped me realize that there's so much more to learn if I simply open my mind up to it. I never knew what was beyond home. I never considered learning what was beyond America. That's the privilege that comes with being born an American, I guess. Again, this type of learning and reflection I don't think would be possible unless we are willing to suspend our professorial gaze and invite students to learn from community members. I yield the floor to Stacy.
Fantastic, everyone. Thanks for being here and sticking with us. So the last component that we have for how to be intentional in a framing and create immersion experiences is being mindful of power dynamics present. So a little bit about my context. My name is Stacy. I have a master's in higher education leadership. So I'm moving from a student affairs social justice center context and now work at a CACC year organization, Pacific Discovery. So we run semester programs all over the world that are a combination of cultural immersion, service learning, and wilderness exploration. So there was a question posed about this supply and demand How do you really keep this intentionality of programming when you have students and a huge growing demand of students going on the programs who either are really excited about rock climbing in Thailand or saving the world, right? Because neither of those intentions are actually in line with what we're talking about here. And I would say that that's the perfect fodder. So that's actually really awesome that you have students who eagerly want to experience a different place. And in many ways, they have this romanticized other of that place that's a really accessible starting point to then actually deconstruct how we've created the other. So really start to look at the stories we hold, whether that's a story of what poverty is, what it means to be from the United States, what we're doing there in terms of helping or saving, or are we coming alongside, are we learning from? So essentially, I think the assumptions in the demand and study abroad actually just start the first stage of the questions we want to ask. And those questions are poking holes at the hierarchies that we have, the unconscious or sometimes quite conscious benevolent isms that we hold often when we're going in other regions in the world. Next slide, John. So step one is how do we think about the other? But step two is really asking students, how do we understand self? And so once we've contextualized relationships for our students with the local communities, we then also need to invite them into a process of being more aware and reflective of their own identities and where those identities fall within privilege, power, oppression, and marginalization. So in large brushstrokes, identity development, this isn't using the formal terms, but paraphrased by me, identity development really moves students from starting at this place of accepting the status quo. So for some students, particularly those who are coming from a majority identity, that's actually often internalized superiority or complete sort of blindness to the power systems that actually impact their day-to-day life, right? For students of color, that could be internalized racism, internalized senses of inferiority, or for all of our students, internalized sense of superiority in relationship to the communities that we're working in. So acceptance of the status quo in terms of identity development is where we start. I think the really great news about identity development is the next stage is dissonance. So really crisis is a powerful thing, right? It's what we want to create because it helps students then start to really look at how they understand themselves and how to maybe challenge the stories that we've been taught. So that dissonance, that encounter is really facilitated through immersion experiences. It's why it's so powerful. And then they move into exploration. And exploration often is people oscillating between resistance and immersion. So for white students, that could be really rejecting the idea of racism to then considering and participating in communities that are thinking more critically about race. For students of color, that can often be wanting to be with communities that share their identities, to then actually wanting to go back to conformity because sometimes socially it's easier, right? So it takes a ton of different patterns, but again, immersion experiences offer that space to create that exploration if you're asking intentional questions, which we'll get to on the slide in a second. And then the final sort of general stage is integration. So how do you move your understanding of yourself into a place that has accepted the problematic stories that we've inherited and has made peace with the privilege and the oppression that comes with that, but then also moves into living and relating to people in a different way. So the great thing is that, and why I gave you questions rather than the theory, is that really the way we support development is by asking questions. And so I think that our programs need to be really intentional for students' emotional development in posing these questions. And the first one is, who am I? Because when you're in that stage of accepting the status quo, you often have identities that aren't that salient, that aren't that relevant or apparent to you day to day. That could be because it's a privileged identity and that's how privilege functions. You don't have to see it. It could be, again, from this internalized racism where you've chosen assimilation and conformity to survive, right? And then, so the first question, who am I, is asking students to think about themselves in terms of the social identities that get put on us every day. The second one is how have I experienced power and oppression along these identities? And that question is really what helps with the crisis, right? So it's not just who am I, what's my race, what's my class, what's my sexuality, but how does that impact my daily lived experience? So in what ways is my personal power conferred or suppressed because of those identities? And what's really great about immersion questions is that that question is supported by this next one. What does this mean for the program? And I think that's because really the best way to ask these questions and engage in this crisis is through relationship. And so it's often easy when the other is really far away to remain in denial. And we see this in our society all the time, right? But when you're now asking these questions about power in the context of someone abroad who you've been thinking of in a certain way that's all of a sudden confronted when you realize your assumptions around inferiority, or someone only 2 miles from your home, but who you weren't experiencing or knowing personally their lived reality until then, that really makes these conversations come alive in a way that is different than just an abstract, discussion of power. The next question, what do I do with this awareness in my life moving forward? So these last two questions are really about re-entry. And if you're doing service learning programs, particularly internationally, you need to be asking so what questions at the end of the program, right? And one of them is, you might be more passionate about issues including racial justice today. What does that mean when you get back home? How is this relevant to the issues in your own home community? And how can you be informed and active in those issues and communities? And then the last one is, how has my understanding of who am I changed as a result, or of who I am changed as a result of this experience? So I love taking students on that full circle journey, where often during orientation, before you take students on a program, you ask questions around social identities that you return to at the end of the program to say, what's more salient? What are you more aware of as a result of these experiences of people coming from different places and actually still connecting on this really human level, maybe through a different personal narrative than before? Next slide, John. So quickly, how do we make this an inclusive practice? I just have 4 things to say real quickly. One is that this is everybody's work. Whether you're in a predominantly white group of students or exclusively white group of students or a very diverse, very racially mixed group, we need to be asking questions of identity. And really, I think one of the ways we make our programs more accessible, if they are still predominantly white, is that we do this work really well and with intention, so that it is more relevant and the program is already more supportive and more attuned to the needs of the population before they even come. And guaranteed they're going to come when you have framing and you're engaging in issues that are gritty and real and feel connected to people's lives. The second one is that you really need to be aware of microaggressions and tokenization. So especially as your demographics change, you're going to see these issues not just between students and community members, but amongst the group that you have. And how do you let that emergence also get worked? Which means being really conscious of the issues, interpersonal issues that are coming up, and how different lines of identity are actually impacting those. And how, as facilitators, do we really hold that? And then intersectionality. So making sure that as we talk about identity, we're talking about all of our identities, that you can't just look at your racial identity without factoring in the way that your class, your gender also impacts your experience in the world. And the last thing is just to make this work holistic. So an assumption that I have is social justice work is really actually healing. It's healing stories that we've learned about ourselves that neglect or really harm the way we connect with other human beings. And so how do you not make this about teaching people the right script so they can talk about these issues in the correct way, but actually learning how to live past these stories that we've inherited into a more loving, equitable model, whether that's with the work we do in local communities, with our groups, or even within our knowledge and understanding and framing of self. Last slide, John. So with that, I just want to return to the definition we gave you at the beginning of what we mean by emergent immersion. It's an approach to community-based learning that's intentional in its framing, as Kira pointed out, rooted in relationship, as Chris spoke to, committed to self-interrogation and inquiry, as John highlighted, and mindful of power dynamics, both historic and present, that Rafiq and I spoke to you about. So thank you so much for your time and listening to what we have to offer, and we're now going to open up this space for questions. So Elaine?
Great. Thank you all so much. And as you can see, John's putting up some of the resources that were mentioned throughout the slide presentation, the webinar. And while I invite you to, we have about 10 minutes left. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box right now, and we'll get to as many as we can. And if we don't get to them, we can also respond after, perhaps through email. What we're going to do, and I'm just going to tell you about some of the follow-up while we wait and see if anyone has questions. You're going to get a link to fill out an evaluation, and probably in there will also be the link to the YouTube channel so that you can come back and access this webinar if you want to watch it again. And then probably within the week we'll be able to, once we get the slides from John and his colleagues, they might have some last minute additions or some changes they need to make based on what was presented today. When we get that, we'll also send that out to all of you because we have your emails because you registered. So I'm not seeing any questions come up in the Q&A. Let me quickly turn to the panelists and see, do any of you have any final thoughts that you want to share? There is the question of, Alexis, let me just really quickly, Alexis, I thought Stacy actually answered your question, but maybe we misunderstood you talking about the supply and demand question. So we thought that Stacy answered that in talking about the balance. That's so if we didn't, please ask your question again and maybe clarify. And Kara, the models do, so I'll ask the panelists if you feel, it seemed like that these models required a faculty member to be present with the students. Can maybe Rafiq, you can clarify, because you talked a little bit about the role of faculty.
Sure. There are lots of different models for studies abroad. I find that in terms of student engagement, the most effective models, frankly, are the ones where they're faculty-led programs. So they tend to be smaller programs or programs with enough representative faculty to really kind of be hands-on with students. That certainly is a lot more work for faculty and for program leadership. But I think the response of students and how students receive it can be more powerful. It's also easier when you have faculty present constantly to really engage meaningfully with community. With that said, I've seen other models, larger models, where they have, for example, a significant staff presence. So faculty, are engaged in kind of the classroom part and are out with students on excursions, but don't necessarily have to do all of the heavy lifting all the time. And for the larger programs, you definitely need to have a good solid staff presence to deal with discipline issues and other issues that come up, and also to help with kind of easing students into the community. One last thing I'd like to say in response to that, one of the things that we've done over the years with our Jamaica program is we bring students back who were particularly engaged with the community as student leaders. So they do some of that work for us or with us in terms of getting students out into the community. It really helps us a lot.
Thank you. So another question. Oh, did somebody else want to go? Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. So my program, we actually use an instructor-led model. And so these are mostly international expats who are fairly young, in their late 20s to mid 30s, who actually live in the communities that we're taking students. And we do design custom programs with universities or high schools because of the relationships that our instructors have. So I think remembering that it doesn't have to be faculty as much as having staff on the ground that are connected to the community, and having that be a co-instructor model where there's someone from the local community and someone from the States to really cross that cultural bridge is another option.
Great, thank you. Alexis asked us another question. What are some of the issues you have observed with students from the diaspora where they are perceived differently than they see themselves? So does anyone want to address?
My question would be for clarification in terms of diaspora. She's talking about Alexis, if you're talking about like the African diaspora, for example, or which diaspora are you referring to? If you're talking about, I'll say just by way of quick example, one of the things when we have Black students who come with us to Jamaica, Black American students, their experience in Jamaica is really interesting because for the first time, I think in most of their lives, they're among the majority all the time because Jamaica is a Black place, but also, and then they feel very engaged and welcomed in that way, but also once they open their mouths, they realize that they are different and that their Americanness often overshadows their Blackness in terms of their master status. So it's this really kind of interesting dynamic that John or I am sure could elaborate on. And from a professor standpoint, as John alluded to, it really does, it places a new challenge on us in terms of negotiating different identities, the different statuses that students kind of come abroad with, because that can often be turned on its head.
And if I could add to that, I think, how we invite students to take up this work is really based on what's coming up for them. I think that if you are a white student coming in and you consider yourself socially justice oriented and you like issues of sustainability, and then you go take Dr. Muhammad's class and learn about the Middle Passage, and different dynamics are opened up to you, it does give them space to kind of work something new, but also engage with what's already up for them. I think that kind of touching back to our faculty required, I think leadership is required. And to Rafiq's point, we always have students go in and again, from the onset, if students are involved or community partners are holding the space for our students, if they know that this is an intentional part of the work that we're asking our students to kind of go through those questions that Stacy had outlined, I think we have a real rich space for the students to do that work. I'd also say that students take up that work in various ways. Students will generally agree that, yeah, I totally want to do that, but as soon as you get them there in the country, they want to, clean something or fix something or do something good right away. I think that's part of our identities too, as being helpers. We can't just say like, oh, I'm not going to be the savior, but not recognize that we're and a pull for us to do that, and vice versa with community partners who have been receiving NGOs and nonprofit support internationally for a long time. It's hard for them to resist to make that initial ask, as opposed to us going in and having conversations and saying, we want you to be co-educators. And the last piece I would say is honoring our partners and their hard work in doing this work. Some of the quotes that Rafiq was sharing about them doing the learning from the community. What we try to do, not always successfully, but we're getting better at it, is trying to figure out how to honor and value that work that they're doing. Because if we see them as co-educators, I think we need to start compensating them like co-educators and showing them that they have a lot of value to our students. Because I also think when our students start seeing us do that, they realize that they are an integrated, real part of the class, not an add-on feature to it.
Okay, any other final thoughts before we only have a minute or two left? So any other final comments from the panelists?
If I can just say one thing very quickly in response to Alexis's follow-up. I appreciate your questions, Alexis. We at CSUSB, we are an Hispanic serving institution. 60% of our student population is Latino, and this year we have 13 students from CSUSB come with us to Jamaica. And one of the more remarkable, the majority of whom were Latino or Asian, actually. And it was interesting just to kind of see how they experienced Jamaica in ways that were different because of a lot of them have family a lot of them are children. Many of them are children of immigrants, and they had been to their parents' homeland, whether it be Mexico or Pakistan or Cambodia. And it was just really interesting to see how they processed the Jamaican experience in ways that were similar to, but different from other students who've come there in the past, because they're not generally a part of the major kind of minority conversation, or at least historically haven't been in the United States, where it's been mostly black and white. So we don't have time for me to elaborate on that, but I just wanted to acknowledge your question and say that it has been interesting to see how different groups respond differently to their experience in Jamaica. Americanness certainly trumps a lot of other things, though.
Well, I want to thank the panelists one last time. Kara has one last question about, do the students have a chance to reflect after when they get back? Do they get back together?
Yes, all right, so their final paper requires them to reflect, but also we have a meeting, at least in our program, we have meetings, informal meetings where we gather all the students and let them kind of reunite and kind of, because they really bond closely while we're in Jamaica. But their final papers, in fact, the quotes that I shared in my part of the presentation were excerpts from their final paper, which involves a reflection component.
I'd just like to quickly add that I think and everyone touched on it, and you know, how do we bring this work back? We're all very interested in making sure that this doesn't just become an experience for a select you know, group of folks, and how can the issues that you experience wherever we go you know, affect what we're doing on our campus. And a lot of the work is based on you know, mutuality and community building. And so you know, we've talked about this idea of, you know, lots of folks feel like when they come to USD, you know, being here is an immersive experience. You know, going into our neighborhood 5 minutes away is an immersive experience. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we're recognizing, you know, these ideas of meaning making, mutuality, community building that aren't just about, you know, space and time. And you know, like the farther you are away, the more that experience just becomes about that particular community. But how can you bring back some of the energy and the passions learned in that group and apply it to what's happening at home?
And I think, you know, Alexis pointed out in a comment in the question in a Q&A box that a lot of alternative break programs are using then local service projects before and after the program. And I always ask our students to come up with a social action commitment and plan. So one area that they've realized they're actually quite passionate about, and then a plan of action in terms of what they're going to do to create change around that when they get back home, which often involves community engagement.
And lastly, I think that connection that we establish, like again, we're practicing it alongside of our students. So the relationships that are formed between us as we're having these conversations extend naturally kind of back home too, because, you know, when students really take up the work, they'll be in your office wanting to continue not just the community engagement, but engaging themselves in that inquiry and that self-interrogation of asking themselves about their identities and how they do this work at home. So I think that's the part that I think keeps me coming back for more and more, is as being able to work with the students consistently as they learn and grow, and as they help me learn and grow too, because I've got my own work that I have to do as well.
Well, I think we could probably go on. I thought we were going to actually get kicked off the platform. But anyway, I'm glad to see we didn't. But thank you all for participating, all the participants who participated on the listening end and also submitted the questions. We were happy to have you join us. And I really do want to thank the panelists one last time. It was really, really great to hear more about your outstanding work, and we will follow up with everybody and get you the links, everyone out there, and the evaluation, and please share your thoughts and any ideas you have for future webinars. So with that, we're going to end the recording and officially end the webinar.